Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Hello, and welcome. Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Very important subject today, Los Campos de Litchfield Park. Very important subject today. A lot of history here of the Mexican-American community. We have great guests today. You know, a couple of shows ago, I had some folks that came to talk about a book being written about Scottsdale. And they were, you could say, the descendants of the pioneering families that came to Scottsdale. I mean, one would not think that Mexicans were here from the very beginning of Scottsdale, especially the concepts that exist today about Scottsdale. But we had the descendants of them in our show. And today, I believe I can say that we have the descendants of the people that came to live and experience a life within the American story, a life in something called Los Campos. So let me say just a little bit more background. We launched AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection, back in May of 2017. And as part of the launch, we had David Murrieta, a local artist, paint a mural. That was part of the launch. And Ruben Rosales, who is one of our guests, came to that event, and we kind of briefly met, and he said, Mr. Parra, I would like to speak to you. You know, hopefully we can connect later on via phone or something. I said, by all means. It took, a few weeks, maybe months, and then we finally connected, and he literally wanted me to go to Litchfield Park and see a museum. And I went. And I got a little tour. And in that little tour, there is an exhibit. And please correct me, whatever I said wrong, I have someone here who can correct me. There's an exhibit called Los Campos. And when I heard the story about what that meant, I said, wow. And then in addition to that, a book has been written called Los Campos, the Camps of Litchfield Park. I'm just setting the stage. There's an amazing story about Mexicans and Mexican Americans who literally came in the early 1900s, if not sooner, to this area of the West Valley. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to introduce our guest today. We have I'm going to go from left to right, Judy Cook. And by the way, when I got to know that Judy Cook was going to be kind of like one of our guests, and she's going to help us to kind of paint the picture of this story from a bigger context. And I got an email from Judy Cook, and I says, that's Curtis Cook's wife. And Curtis Cook happens to be a former co-worker of mine. So I said, man, the world is kind of small, isn't it? So let me, again, come from left to right. Judy Cook. And Judy Cook, you are how do you pronounce the word, curator?
Curator and an archivist.
Curator and an archivist for the Litchfield Park Museum.
Correct.
That's kind of like the keeper, right?
Yeah.
The keeper, kind of.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and Judy, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. And then Ruben Rosales. And Ruben Rosales, now, did you say that some of your relatives live in Los Campos? Is this good? First of all, Ruben, thank you so much, because thanks to you, I got to know this story. And thanks to you, we have a radio show today. So thank you and welcome to our show.
Thank you.
How do you feel that this eventually happened?
Well, it's great. There's a lot of history. I remember a lot of that history. That's why I'm volunteering at the museum.
Perfect.
And I didn't live at the Campos. But I was born and raised about 5 miles from the Campos. And I had relatives in the Campos. So at that time, we used to visit the relatives a lot and join them in fiestas and celebrations.
So you got to visit Los Campos.
Oh, yes.
Perfect. And now let me ask Belen Soto Moreno. Now, Belen, did I miss it that you have a doctorate, a PhD, or a master's or some sort?
I have a master's.
A master's. Okay. Belen Soto Moreno, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
How do you feel about a show like this?
I feel very glad to have it take place because I really want not only my children but grandchildren to know what it was like to live in Los Campos.
Wow, thank you. We're going to get to the meat of this in just a bit. And then Cruz, is it Pariga? Pariga Dominguez. And again, you are a co-author. By the way, this book has two authors, and I see it on the back, and it's the two of you, so I assume that you are the co-authors of this book. So you are Cruz. Thank you, Cruz, and welcome to our show.
Thank you for inviting us.
And so how do you feel? I mean, you are a writer of this book. How do you feel that, first of all, that it was written, and then now we even have a radio show to kind of showcase it?
It's important for the people to know where we lived and how we lived. I was born in one of the camps, and my parents lived there and got married there, and my siblings were all born in the camps. So it's exciting, and our children don't know anything. They don't ask any questions. So this is a way for them to know who they were, how we lived, and more about the camps.
I had a conversation briefly with you yesterday, and you told me that you did not visit Phoenix until you were, how old again?
Oh, my gosh. That was in grade school,
grade
I guess.
school,
yeah.
And you had not visited Phoenix. You were your world, your life was in Los Campos, in Litchfield Park.
Exactly, yes.
Isn't that amazing? But you used to hear about the Calderón, the fiestas, the Riverside, and all that.
Afterwards,
did you get to go to those?
No, my father wanted to make sure that we went to school. So going to high school meant college in those days for us. So
right.
He said, you have to go to school.
Can you repeat that again? Mm-hmm. Going to high school was the equivalent of going to college today.
Exactly,
wow.
Yes. A lot of our kids that went to school with us, 8th grade was it. I mean, a lot of our uncles says, no, you need to work. You're going to stop right here, and that's it. But my dad said, no, you're going to go to school.
Now, there was a kind of an urgency to work in those days because maybe they didn't see the purpose of going to school, but more so it was to help with the family, right?
Exactly,
so that's why it was so common for children, actually, and young people to go to work and not pursue education.
Exactly, because everybody had a limited education, so the only thing available was being in the camps, working in the fields, and doing that kind of work.
Right.
So,
Thank you, and welcome again. You know, we have about a minute and a half, Judy, and I'm going to ask you, and then probably, or most likely, I will interrupt you, and then we'll continue on the second. But first, what would you relate the story that is told in that museum? Because that museum tells a story, and then you can set the stage for us to then address life in Los Campos.
Okay. Our museum addresses largely the history of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Arizona, and Los Campos is a great part of that. So Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was a rubber manufacturer in Akron, Ohio, that was founded in 1898 and named after Charles Goodyear. Charles Goodyear was deceased at that point. He died in 1860, and the company was named in his honor because he was the one who discovered vulcanization of rubber, which is the hardening of rubber. So into this new company, which was founded by Frank and Charles Seiberling in 1898, comes a man by the name of Paul Litchfield. He was hired in 1900 as a factory superintendent. So time goes on, and in 1916, they reach a crisis. They need cotton to produce their tires. And one might ask why in the world you would need cotton. They needed a certain type called long staple, which is a long fiber, and there were only two places in the world where you could get it. One was out of Egypt, and Egypt at that time was in the middle of World War I, and the Mediterranean and the west coast of Europe was being patrolled by German U-boats, which were small submarines, so you couldn't get through to Egypt. The other place was along the barrier islands of our country, and all of the cotton in the south was infested with boll weevil, which is a pest that eats the bud of the cotton so that it can't mature into a mature cotton boll. So the government had come out to the Salt River Valley thinking that this would be a good place to grow it because the climate is similar to Egypt.
Right.
And Paul Litchfield came out in 1916 trying to convince the farmers and ranchers in Arizona, please grow this cotton for us. And they said, no, it's too big a risk. So Paul Litchfield went back to his superiors in Akron and he said, let's go out there and lease and buy our own land and raise our own cotton, and then we will have a continual source for it. The cotton was used to take back to Akron to weave into a cloth that would be embedded in the tread of the tire because they were moving from solid rubber to air-inflated tires. And this cotton cloth helped to keep that tire puncture-proof. So it was critical that they had that for the development of the tires. So he came out here, and in 1917, they established a subsidiary called Southwest Cotton Company.
And I'm going to stop you there.
Okay, good.
Okay, the Southwest Cotton Company. We'll pick up on that when we return. Stay with us. We're going to go on a short break. You're listening to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. The subject today, Los Campos de Litchfield Park. And Judy Cook is sharing with us a fuller context of life in Los Campos. And we stopped, Judy, at Southwest Cotton Company. Go ahead.
Correct. So that subsidiary was established in 1917, and they began with 2 ranches simultaneously. One was in Chandler, and it was named Goodyear Ranch, to make things even more confusing. And the second was established west of the Agua Fria River, and that was called Litchfield Ranch. About 2 years later, they purchased a third area up in the Sun City area, and they named it Marinette Ranch. So the 3 ranches were cotton-producing ranches. So at that time, they needed workers. So Phoenix was an extremely small town. The people that were hired at the Goodyear Ranch in Chandler were largely African American and Yaqui Indians. The people that were hired out at the Litchfield Ranch were of Mexican American heritage. Many came from surrounding states and had been previously working in mines, and they would rather work on the land than in the mines, which you can understand. And the other area was the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company got a special permit from the government to recruit Mexican workers from Mexico who could come up here and work 6 months a year and then go back home for 6 months. Well, this was appealing to those workers because there was a lot of trouble with the revolution in Mexico and issues there that encouraged workers to seek a better area. And many of those Mexicans who came up from Mexico stayed and applied for citizenship. So these people began working in Litchfield Park in 1917, and as time developed over the 1920s, the ranch grew larger. They got rid of the ranches in Marinette and the Goodyear Ranch in Chandler, and they took their best people from those 2 ranches, brought them out to the Litchfield Ranch, and expanded the land operation. So when that land expansion happened in 1929, they established what's called Los Campos. They were 5 basic residential camps that were spread out throughout Litchfield Ranch because it was a huge property. It went from south of Luke Air Force Base all the way down to present-day Highway 85. And they did all sorts of things along with growing the cotton. They experimented with the green feeding of cattle, the raising of horses, crop rotation, irrigation, and eventually turned that into what was called Goodyear Farms. And these men and women who worked from the camps took care of everything that went on in Litchfield Park and at Goodyear Farms, working at the wigwam, building the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, working in the fields, tending the cattle, and have an incredible story to tell. So in 1929, that's when we see the beginning of the camps, which is where the book takes up that the two ladies wrote.
This book right here. So let me come to Belen. Belen, can we begin to describe the life in Los Campos? Who was there? The type of work that they were doing, the houses they live in. I understand they first live in tents, and then they built houses. Would you mind just the two of you, if you don't mind, just begin to describe life in Los Campos, and you can speak to the mic close.
I was born in Marinette, and my father and mother lived there. And when I was 9 months old, hired as an irrigation foreman for the West Side. And life in the camp, what it was like for us, was great because we knew everybody. I lived in Camp 54. Everybody knew everybody, and they helped each other. Everyone watched for the kids, so we couldn't get into trouble because our parents found out right away. And life was like that for the children that lived in the other camps. We spoke only Spanish, learned only Spanish, so when they established the camps and we could go to school in Litchfield, it was very difficult for some of us because we couldn't speak English. When we were 7 years old, we had to go into a special class, which we called baby class, because we couldn't go into first grade.
Right.
And we had a teacher that knew Spanish but could only speak English to us. And we learned to read out of the Scott Forsman series of Sally, Dick, and Jane. Personally, for me, when I learned English, it was great. And I wanted to be a teacher. I decided that I wanted to be just like Miss Gomez and teach others.
At one point, I believe in our phone conversation, you told me that it seemed very unusual, kind of weird that you made an assumption that everybody spoke Spanish. So when you met the kids who didn't, it seemed like they were the weird ones, quote unquote, right?
And Cruz will say this too. We never saw any other children that spoke English.
Right.
So, like I said, it was very difficult for some of us. We would be punished because we spoke Spanish at school. But we found a way to stay away from where the teachers were.
What was the punishment?
You were spanked. Your hair was pulled.
Maybe something like this, English, and then they pull the hair? English?
Yeah, English.
Or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had an incident that happened to me and one of my friends that I would rather not talk about here, but we were punished. Two of us were punished, and we couldn't do anything about it but cry.
Obviously, it was difficult to understand as a child what was going on.
Yes, it was very difficult.
Yeah.
And
You know, Cruz, can you pick up the conversation now from there and kind of elaborate a little bit more? So, anything about school that you want to add or move beyond that?
I wanted to let you know about the houses where we lived. Okay,
Yes.
the houses were either made of wood or they had adobe, and they were really small. They were 300 square feet to 500 square feet, and you know the Mexican families are large.
Right.
So in my grandmother's case, the women lived in one house, the men lived in a tent, and then they had the other house was used as a kitchen and living room. So, and they were not insulated, so you know the hot summers and
I
the
can
cold.
imagine.
So it had to be hard on them, really difficult for them to live like that. But
They were made of adobe, right?
or just wood,
And
no
well, with
insulation or
this
whatever.
Adobe kind of helps it a little bit to keep it a little better, but still with no AC, it was tough, huh?
And some of those adobe ones didn't have a floor; it was dirt floors.
Dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And then the kids would play barefooted on the
Exactly.
on the
We
street.
didn't own but one pair of shoes, so we would go and play in the ditches and stuff and that. And sometimes we would cut our feet and we just get some little bit of mud and stuff, and do our own thing and stuff. So yeah, but it was a hard life for our parents and stuff. So we really admire for what they did for us, and
Yeah.
and thank them for what they did for us.
Now, in just the brief conversations that we had over the phone,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know to whom I told that I happened to have been born in Mexico and
Mm-hmm.
came to the United States when I was 12 years old. And the life you describe is literally the life that I lived in Mexico, or at least similar to it. So this was a very Mexican type of life in terms of the food and I mean even the meat that was cooked. I don't know what it's called, estilo Sonora, right? Where they bury or they make a big hole, and what is that called?
They used to do that for the celebrations that we used to have. Goodyear Farms would let the people, they'd slaughter cows and stuff, and the meat was used, and they offered it to the people from the camps and stuff. I don't know what they called it, but it was underground barbecue. That's the way I knew, yeah.
And in terms of music, were there groups that were playing, or it was more a player, a city?
Almost everybody sang, and they had them. They would make their own instruments and stuff, and they were used for celebrations, or the men would go serenade their wives on Mother's Day or birthdays, and then the boys would serenade their girlfriends and stuff like that. But it was a hard life because there was no washing machines or anything like that. Everything was done with a tub and a scrub board and stuff, and so our mothers had to heat the water and wash and do all that and hang them out to dry. And then a lot of the clothes were made by our grandmothers and our aunts. Sometimes they would even use the flour sacks because tortillas are made every day, and you could just smell the wonderful tortillas and the
this
food
is
cooking.
corn or
flour tortillas.
Flour, estilo Sonora, right?
Even little ones to the big
huge
giant ones, yeah.
They call them sobaqueras these days.
Oh, see, I didn't know that. But yeah. Wow. So the food was wonderful, especially for the holidays. See, when they made for Christmas, my grandmothers and my aunts and my mom, everybody get together and make tamales. And then they would also make for New Year's buñuelos.
And you had all this, how they call it, home medicine?
Oh, yes.
Remedios for everything,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Do you recall some of those?
I wrote about that, and one of the things, then they were laughing, my kids were laughing, because if you had a fever, they would get a potato and peel it and then slice it, and they would place it on your forehead. And back then, they had the big work handkerchiefs. The men used to have the red and blue, and those were put on there. And then a lot of, like manzanilla, and they would have, and especially if you were sick, and they would put Vicks on you, and the kids would stay away from you because you would smell,
Of course.
And that was one of the things they used to do. But they had all kinds of things they used to do. And then, of course, they had, for cough and stuff, the honey and the teas and stuff like that. So it was wonderful.
Yeah, it seems, I usually tell my story because I grew up very poor in Mexico as well. And when you're growing up, you don't know anything else. So you don't even think that you're poor. It's normal to you, right? So stay with us. We're going to take our second break. We are addressing Los Campos de Litchfield Park. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. We are talking about Los Campos de Litchfield Park, and I'm holding in my hands the book, Los Campos, the Camps of Litchfield Park, and co-authors, we have Cruz Pariga Dominguez and Belen Soto Moreno. They are the co-authors of this book. Now, is there how can people get this book? Anybody?
Okay, it's only at the museum. You have to go and purchase it there because we self-published, so we had to be there.
So the museum in Litchfield Park is for sale there.
Mm-hmm,
Perfect.
Exactly. Let's
continue to elaborate. What more can you say about life in Los Campos? I mean, it was very simple. I think it was a simple life, lots of work. How about women? I mean, were women? I also read a little bit about the cotton that sometimes it was a family ordeal, that families used to go. Can you elaborate on that? Anybody?
Because we never had babysitters where you went somewhere, the whole family went. And you know how
such thing, huh?
No. You know how cotton doesn't weigh anything, you know? Mm-hmm. But they used to pay, the wages were $1 all the way to maybe $2.50 for 100 pounds. They really had to work hard, so that's what they did for the extra money, so the families would go and pick cotton. We picked cotton when we were little.
So women, the role of women there was basically to stay home and take care of, the family.
The mothers stayed home. They took care of the family by cooking. And I think Chris already mentioned that they washed the clothes in hot water. There were no washing machines at that time.
Right.
And one of the things that the mother made was providing the lunch for the kids at school. And one of the things that they did, we as kids did, was we would hide, because there was a place for all of us to have lunch, But we would hide because our lunch was tortillas and beans or, whatever our mother cooked. And the other kids all had sandwiches, So we would hide, and it's ironic now that you go into a restaurant and they have burritos there.
Right.
Not sandwiches. What we used to hide from.
Right.
And even the American restaurants have burritos. They advertise green burritos are available here,
Real quick, healthcare. What kind of healthcare did you have? Were there doctors there?
There was a doctor.
Childbearing, all that kind of good stuff? Or giving birth? How was that?
They gave birth at home. There would be ladies that would help the doctor to deliver the babies. In Litchfield, there was a doctor, Dr. Hilton, and the mothers would see Dr. Hilton, and he would come to the home and deliver the babies. But there would always be a woman there that would help, would make sure there was enough hot water, that there was the bedding was clean and ready for the doctor. I was born in Marinette, not in one of the camps.
What is now Sun City?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And at that time, my mother was seeing a doctor from Glendale. But when it came time for me to be delivered, there was no doctor around. So it was a horse doctor or a vet that delivered me.
Amazing. So they knew how to do it too, huh?
Yeah.
Were you going to say something,
That's
Judy?
what I wanted to tell you.
Okay. Yeah. Ruben, you've been pretty quiet. Go ahead and add anything. I'm sure you have a lot of memories. You've heard, you had relatives there. Go ahead.
Now, just when Cruz was mentioning about music, we had what do you call a placita, where we used to have bands
This
there.
placita was in the middle of the campus somewhere?
No, it's in the corner of Litchfield and Indian School Road.
So apart from the campus.
Right.
Okay.
And it was centralized. It was next to the store,
And
to
that's
the
where you
grocery
had all
store.
the fiestas.
Yes, especially Cinco de Mayo. And they had food booths there. And then I was about 10 years old. We just played around there. And later on, I remember Belen's dad. They used to call him Coyote because he had a little band. They used to call him Los Coyotes. Remember Belen?
Yes.
And they used to play little dances in the campus when they had birthdays and celebrations. Yeah.
And you're saying that in those days, most people spoke Spanish?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Especially
And
our parents.
They would water the streets, and we knew when the dirt street was watered that there was
The party was coming.
There was going to
course.
be a dance.
Right.
Especially when the men either left for World War II or when they got back.
Let's talk about that. You know, I even read a story of a Mexican person who basically he had to go back to Mexico because not being an American, he wouldn't get to go to serve. And that was who?
My tío.
Please, by all means, you tell the story.
Yeah.
It was my tío Miguel Bejarano.
Bejarano?
His parents wanted him to go back to Mexico and not go into the war. But he said no, that he was going to fight. He was going to fight, and not only for the people from the camps, but for all the people in the United States, to keep everybody.
Amazing.
But there was 184 men from the camps that were drafted.
184. This is
men.
for World War II?
World War II. Yes.
Amazing.
And most of the men, they had never gone to school, maybe third grade, fourth grade. Some of them had never left Arizona before, and so they were drafted, and they were in the European and the Pacific theaters. And some of the men, it was a big hardship for the families because they were the older family members that were drafted.
Right.
So in our case, my nanas, my three uncles were drafted at one time. There was another family their name was Del Castillo, and they had 7 sons, but 5 of them were drafted at the same time. So
they probably left 2 so that they could still take care of the rest of the family. I assume there were some concepts or principles in that regard.
And the sad part, the first one that was killed from the camps was one of their sons, Joaquin.
Wow.
There was 3 Mexican Americans that were killed. There were 7 in all from the camps.
Right.
But
out of that 184,
there were 7.
7 were killed.
But 3 were the Mexican Americans: Joaquin del Castillo and Frank Romero, and Armando.
Now, I read about in your book that there's some plays where their names are recorded.
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
In 1943, they did a monument. It was made out of wood. They had the names of all the soldiers, and because of the weather and everything, it just deteriorated, so they didn't have it anymore. But the Litchfield Park Historical Society, in 2007, they did one out of bronze and stucco, and so those names are there forever. The 184 men's names are there forever.
And even in your book, there's a section where you have all the names and then even a picture.
I wanted to honor the ones because we have pictures of a lot of them. A lot of them were my tios and everything, so we had the pictures.
Of course.
But a lot of them, we couldn't find them. A lot of them were deceased, and so what we did is dedicate a page of all the names of the ones that served that we could not get any pictures from. So, but interesting too that one of my uncles, later on, he was 90 when he told us that he was a messenger for MacArthur. He would take messages and another one of the gentlemen, that was Enrique del Castillo. He would have been with a color guard with General Patton, but he was too tall, so he wasn't able to do it. Another of the men, his name was last name was Flores. He was a prisoner of war in the German camps, and so he was there for 6 months, a prisoner of war, and lost 60 pounds.
There is a last name. I'm sorry, I apologize. There is a last name that you mentioned, Cons. Do you know anybody? Because I know someone that works for Chicanos por la Causa whose last name is Cons, Pedro Cons. Do you know about that family by chance?
In fact, the one that was on the picture where the first one that was erected, his name was Loreto Cons, and he's married to my aunt. So
do you know Pedro Cons?
I knew I don't know, it must be the son because there was a big family,
Yes.
But I know most of them, they're all deceased now, the older ones.
Right.
There's a picture in the book of the father and the mother and all the children and Pedro's pictures in there
Can
and
you
all that.
relate just a little bit the mood, of the drafting of these folks to go serve? Do you have any recollection?
Well, my mom and them said it was hard because it was the older, and so the women were left to work, and the younger kids were left to work the fields, and so they had a group of women, and Belen's dad was what would they call him, the supervisor or whatever, and the women had to go work in the fields, and I remember my mom saying that she cried all day long because it was hard work. It was working in the heat and such, and so. They weren't used to that, so it was the women that took over.
I can imagine also for those folks that went to serve how difficult it must have been, because if you've never left your people, your town, I mean, it must be a difficult experience.
It was, and and so they said that as soon as somebody was coming back, the word would spread throughout all the camps, and then they would get together and make a big party and a big celebration as they come back. So that was a wonderful thing. They said
this went on in how many camps again?
Five camps. Yes,
and they were very united
because somebody would marry somebody from this camp, and they were your cousin or aunt, and somebody would marry this other person, and they were, in a way, we're all related.
So what's the point? Why different camps? Were there different functions that a camp perhaps had, or the people from one camp had, or it was Judy? On that?
The 5 camps were located in different parts of the property. The property was about 16,000 acres. So the 2 camps that Cruz and Belen come from were on the west side of the property, and Belen's father was the irrigation foreman for the west side of the property. Then there were 2 on the east side, and the southernmost one had most of the cowboys. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the north one, Camp 50, most of those people, I think, worked at the wigwam. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then Camp 52, where Rudy came from, that's Belen's husband, they tended the feedlot and took care of the cattle there, which was right alongside of their camp.
We have to go on the next last break, but can you just say about the wigwam, just very briefly, the concept of how it started and how it became what it is today, real brief.
The wigwam was the first building was built 100 years ago this year in the winter of 1918-19, and it was because it took a full day to get from Phoenix out to Litchfield Park. So when you did that, you couldn't return to Phoenix easily to stay overnight. So they built a small facility for the people from Akron who could come and stay when they were visiting the Litchfield Ranch. Over time, that grew, and in 1929, they added to that building and opened it up to the public. And this was right when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression was starting. So it was a facility built that would appeal to the wealthy and near wealthy. And the camp people took care of the wigwam. They grew the vegetables in the gardens there. They washed the linen. They cleaned. They were gardeners, all sorts of things. So there were opportunities to do things there instead of working in the fields.
Thank you. We have to go on our last break. Stay with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. We'll be right back.
Welcome to AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. Educate. Celebrate. Connect. Arizona Hispanic Connection.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. This is AARP Arizona Hispanic Connection. Los Campos de Litchfield Park is the subject today. And let me just say a little something. I just feel a sense of gratitude every time we address these issues, because those of us who came to this country later on, I almost feel like we got it a lot easier than those that came before us. They pretty much set the stage for education for so many areas of this of the American life that sometimes those of us who came, in the 70s, 80s, and it's much easier. So let's go back to talk about Belen. This education, you were doing basically you experienced a pioneering work or had a pioneering experience when it comes to education. Tell us about that.
Okay, as I said before, I had to go to a class and learn English before I could go to first grade. Mm-hmm. It was then that I decided that I wanted to become a teacher. Mm. Later on, I realized that it would be difficult for my parents to send me to college to become a teacher because they did not have the money. And they didn't it wasn't as expensive as it is to go to college now, but at that time they weren't making that much money. So I kind of realized that it was a dream and that I wasn't going to be able to go to college. Lucky for me, there was a teacher named Francis Amavisca, Francis Ibarra, who then became Francis Amavisca, who asked me what I wanted to do after I graduated. I said, well, probably go to Phoenix, get a job. I've taken classes that would help me get a job. And she says, but what do you really want to do? I want to be a teacher. Wow. And she looked at me, pointed her finger at me, and said, you are going to go to college and you are going to be a teacher.
Amazing.
And I thought, well, my parents can't afford it, and they are very strict with me. They will never let me go. Mm. And once again, she says, I'll take care of it.
Wow.
You are going to be a teacher. Wow. She went out to where my father was working, not once, but twice, and finally convinced them that I should be a teacher.
Amazing. And now you have even got a master's degree.
Yes.
That's amazing.
And so she went, talked to my father, convinced him, then told me one day when we were having semester exams not to go home on the first bus because she was going to go talk to my mother. Mm. And I said, okay. So I stayed. And when I got home, I noticed my mother had been crying. Mm. And she asked me in Spanish, ¿Quieres ir al colegio? Sí, mamá. Mm. ¿De veras quieres ir al colegio? Sí, mamá. La tercera vez, otra vez, ¿de veras quieres ir al colegio? Sí, mamá. Tienes mi bendición.
Mm. Wow.
And then we were both crying.
Amazing. That difficult to go to school in those days.
Yeah, yes. And like I said, they were very, very strict with me.
Thank you for that. That's an amazing and very touching experience. Judy, can you relate to us, because the Mexican community was also very instrumental in the building of St. Thomas
Aquinas
Church.
Yes, Paul Litchfield was very dedicated to having churches built for his employees because this was company land. Right. So he was responsible for seeing that small Mexican-American mission church was built. It was a small one. It's still extant in Litchfield Park. Right. That small mission church has now grown into the large St. Thomas Aquinas on Thomas Street, which is one of the largest churches in the state of Arizona, largest Catholic churches. Right. And he was also responsible for building the church at Litchfield Park. So he was committed to that.
Right. Please also mention the cemetery, because that's another point. And I'm having you to kind of do it briefly because of the time.
The cemetery was begun by the Southwest Cotton Company in 1918 because of the Spanish flu pandemic, which was a worldwide pandemic. And when the soldiers came back from war, they also brought that flu with them, and people died. That cemetery is still in existence. It's a historic cemetery, and people who can validate that they worked at Goodyear Farms are still buried there. And it's a beautiful cemetery, and you can visit that today as well. And I just want to mention one more thing, because Belen didn't say this, but there is to be a new school named after Belen Soto in the Litchfield district.
That's great.
In her honor as being the first Mexican-American to go on to college from that area.
First Mexican-American to go to college. Amazing, amazing. You know, before we wrap it up and maybe give a chance to the rest, just you, Judy, in handling and dealing with this information research, what are some of your insights, thoughts, feelings about this community? That having pretty much done, I assume, a lot of research on this.
It's an extraordinary community and an extraordinary story, and I'm particularly fond of these people. If I could be anything, I'd probably be Mexican-American. But when we went through the research, it was really interesting for me to see how similar our lives were, because I came from a very poor family, even though it was a different cultural heritage. So as these people come through the exhibits and they look at it and I hear their stories, we have commonalities. And now, as time has gone on and these cultures are merging together, many of these families have intermarried with different cultural heritage, as has mine. I have a Mexican-American daughter-in-law, and I have a granddaughter that is half Anglo, half Mexican-American, who in turn has married a full-blooded man from Bangkok, Thailand. Wow. And I have 3 great-grandchildren with all of that rich heritage who are absolutely beautiful. So to me, it's an expression of what America is, this incredible attempt to bring all these diverse faiths and cultures together, to love each other and work together and turn this country into something that we should be proud of. That's a unique experience. Right. And there is more that binds us than divides us. So while we're celebrating these rich cultural heritages, the fact that there are so many more things that connect us as human beings is wonderful. And I totally identify with them. I just absolutely adore them. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's kind of wrap it up. Any final thoughts? Let's come back to you, Cruz. You said that you wanted to write this book so that your family, your kids would you can grab the mic. Just any final thoughts?
In talking about the cemetery, my grandfather was one of the people that built the coffins for the people because there wasn't any would get them, and my mom and my aunt were one of the ones that decorated that did that. So everything was done by the people themselves. Right. The cemetery, the men digging the graves and such. Mm-hmm. But this is all something that's very important for our kids to know, and for the people that live in Litchfield Park to know, because there's nothing to show that the camps were there. They don't know what's, new people coming in and everything. And even our own Mexican families, they didn't know about our grandparents, great-grandparents. Wow. So this is something that's they can
so everybody
be able to
sees Litchfield Park as it is today and have this view of it, but there's this history, this rich history behind it.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Ruben, any final thoughts that you want to add? I know you didn't share a lot, but I'm sure that you also have your memories.
Well, I wasn't raised in the Campos, but I was close to them, and we lived like the Campos. We used to heat up the water out on the side. We had to chop wood to cook inside. We had the outhouses, and it was same kind of life, But one thing I want to mention where the museum is, in case somebody wants to visit.
Please.
It's in the corner, northwest corner of Litchfield Road and Camelback Road. And we're open Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday from 10 to 4 o'clock.
And you do tours, right?
And we do tours,
Yeah.
right.
Go ahead.
Ruben is one of our bilingual docents, so you can come and visit him.
Oh, perfect. So if anybody prefers to get the tour in Spanish, you're the man. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does this book mean to you now that it's done? I'm sure it took some effort to put it together.
I wanted this book done because there was another book about Litchfield, but it never mentioned the camps. It never mentioned the men and women that worked hard to make Goodyear Farms and Litchfield what it is today.
Wow. Thank you. That does it. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was AARP, Arizona Hispanic Connection. Have a great day.
Arizona Hispanic Connection.